try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for
A bit after 2. Welcome, Volunteers for Israel Educates, episode number, gosh, I don't know, what is it? 160 maybe?
No,
I should have written that number down.
isn't it over 200 at this point?
250? I'm losing track. Anyhow, we're blessed to see. We are blessed today to have a return lecturer, and I'm really looking forward to what he has to explain, because he did a very good job about 6 or 8 months ago, which was up on YouTube, and a number of people have looked at as a reference point. So thank you for joining with us. Just a couple of very quick announcements. For those who are wondering if VFI is sending volunteers to Israel, the answer is yes. There are people there right now. There are people who just came home. There are people on this call that just came back. We've been very active since June. We had several different programs. The most popular one at the moment, by far, is the program at the Youth Rehabilitation Hospital in Tel Aviv, and we have a constant presence there. It seems like that particular program has turned out to be quite a hit. All of our programs are all-encompassing. That is, they include everything except for your airfare and personal health insurance. Personal health insurance, it turns out, if you need it, it has to be valid in Israel, is relatively cheap. It's been costing folks anywhere between 50 and 80 bucks for a month worth of insurance, health insurance that is, valid in Israel. So that's turned out to be not a monetary obstacle for almost anybody. This session is being recorded, and with the Eyal's permission, we will put it up on YouTube within a couple of days. And it also, if you like, you can also watch captioning in real time as people speak by just clicking the button on the bottom of your screen that says something about captions. I personally need it all the time, and it's very helpful. So VFI is alive and running. We have a full program going into 2025. The website, the VFI USA.org, our website, vfi-usa.org, has been completely reworked. It contains 6 programs, six separate programs. And the last program, number 6, is a program whereby we offer our touring and guiding and volunteering services to any affiliated organization that is an organization of friends or groups from synagogues, churches, whatever, and we have prepared custom touring for them. So if you folks know anybody or any organization that you're tied in with that is looking to go to Israel and have some very interesting volunteer-oriented experiences, let us know. Julia will jump right in and create a highly customized program, be it Judaica or Christianity or whatever it is your interests are. We can flavor it with a lot of that good stuff, plus some serious volunteering. Our newest program involves volunteering of all things on an IDF base, and we've just gotten cranked up with that, and a couple of folks are starting, as we just spoke, this weekend or next weekend for a week program, and it's called Feed the Troops. It involves actually working on an IDF base in uniform with food trucks that travel among other IDF bases and prepare meals for soldiers. It's turning out to be quite a popular program. At that point, I'd like to turn over to Alana to see if she has anything to add today, and then Julia will introduce our wonderful speaker.
Hi, I don't have too much to add. Just if you decide to sign up for one of our trips and you hear from me, I'm the one who's going to be making sure we have all your paperwork. So I know Deborah's on here today, and I've been I just sent her an email. So no, that's the point of contact. A lot of times I'll probably send you to Steve or to Julia or to Pam on here in case there's questions I can't answer, but looking forward to having many more of you join us. So I'll hand it over to Julia so she can make the introduction.
Hey, thank you, Ilana. Ilana is the best by far, and whatever you need, she will be able to answer your questions. And only because she's so polite, so occasionally she will ask me to participate in the conversation. So without further, hey, Harry, delay, I would like to introduce a colleague, a friend, a wonderful speaker, a wonderful guide, a wonderful specialist, Dr. Eyal Dujovny. He has a PhD. He is an anthropologist and Israeli government licensed tour guide. First and foremost, he is an expert on Israel and the Middle East, as well as an educator and cross-cultural broker who explores the intersection of society, politics, and history. Dr. Dujovny pursues holistic approaches in his work that provide both depth and nuance to his writing and tours. So I'm very happy and privileged to have you with us tonight. Thank you for coming, and the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you so much. Let me just share the screen. 1 second. Hopefully this works.
I just want to interrupt and just say if you could all please stay muted unless you're speaking. That would be great. If I mute you, just remain muted.
Can you see?
Perfect.
You see the presentation?
Yep.
Yes? All right. So it's a go. Well, thank you again. Thank you for inviting me once again. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here and just talk about something that's really close to my heart. As an anthropologist, obviously, I'm into cultures. And one of the amazing things about Israel is that there are so many different cultures that you can experience when you're here. And I wanted to provide a framework for thinking about not only learning a little bit today about the different cultures, but also a framework for thinking about culture in Israel over time and space. So without further ado, Israel's cultural mosaic. I want to start by situating ourselves and the land of Israel, which is located at the crossroads of the three old world continents, which is one of the reasons that it has always been a very multicultural place. What do I mean by a crossroads? Over here on the left, you can see a 16th century cloverleaf map. This was designed to show the centrality of Israel. According to this map, the holy city of Jerusalem, or Zion, is at the center of the world. And the implication of this map is that the land of Israel is a land bridge. Is there a question?
No, people just keep unmuting. Just please stay muted for the whole presentation. Thanks.
Okay. By this, when I'm saying that it's a land bridge, I mean that before there were ships or airplanes, the only way to go from Africa to Europe or Asia to Africa meant crossing through the land of Israel. In addition, it is only a short distance between the Mediterranean Sea, which is an arm of the Atlantic Ocean, and the Red Sea, an arm of the Indian Ocean. Hence, Israel was also a sea bridge. So we have a land bridge and a sea bridge. You can see kind of like an X marks the spot. In fact, the sea bridge was very important and explains why Gaza is where Gaza is, because it was a rich trading post between Europe and Asia, and it was the place where all the trade passed through, and that's how Gaza became a city and became important. So put differently, what we could say is that X marks the spot. Now, how do we know this? We know already from the Torah or the Old Testament that we have clear evidence of long-distance trade routes and a grasp of geography that included no fewer than 70 nations. We also have evidence that these trade routes existed because of the ceremonial need for spices, such as cassia, that comes from India and was used in the temple service. So 3,000 years ago, they were trading cassia all the way from India to Israel to be used in the temple in Jerusalem. Recently in Jerusalem, archaeologists discovered physical evidence of vanilla in the city of David from 2,600 years ago. No one understands how a spice that at the time supposedly only existed in the Americas found its way across the world to Jerusalem. So this remains a mystery, but it certainly implies long-distance trade routes. And we have other examples of connections to other parts of the world from ancient times. For example, loanwords that entered Hebrew from Indian languages. Many Hebrew speakers don't realize that the word kof, which means monkey in Hebrew, actually comes from a South Indian language where it's kopi, or tuki, which is parrot in Hebrew, is also from South India. And the word kinar is an Indian instrument, which is a type of harp or lyre. And from where we get the word kinor in Hebrew, which is a violin. And we also get the word Kinneret. So the word Kinneret, which is the name of the Sea of Galilee, comes from an Indian word and an Indian root based on an instrument that looked in that shape. So the important thing to remember is what they used to always say, location, location, location. Today with the internet, people don't talk about location as much. It used to be location was the most important thing when you designed a store, for example, where to put it. Today, location is less important, but in ancient times, location was very important, and Israel had the most strategic location among the three Old World continents and a connection as a land and sea bridge between them. I want to give you some more examples and proof of this. Let's jump forward 1,000 years from the time of King Solomon and the city of David. If we jump forward and we look at the miracle of Pentecost, this is something that's mentioned in the New Testament in the book of Acts, Acts 2, verses 1 to 11. There's a story about a miracle in which tongues of fire, as you can see on the left here, the light, tongues of fire descend from heaven, and the disciples of Jesus spontaneously learn to speak a variety of languages. For our purposes, this is important because it's proof that Jerusalem was a meeting place, or what is known as an entrepot, for people from all three world continents in the first century. In this scene, if we begin from verse 7, what we see is that people in the streets of the city are surprised by linguistic abilities of the disciples. And they say out loud, they say, aren't all these people, all those who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Parthians, which is Persia, Medes also in that area, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia. These are all places in the three continents. Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, North Africa, visitors from Rome, Italy, Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans from the islands, Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Proof that there were people from all of these nations there at that time, which is really quite amazing if you think about the distances involved that people had to traverse, and yet it speaks to the centrality of Jerusalem in the world, in the ancient world. Now, anytime a place is central, a lot of people are going to be crossing through there, and I want to talk a little bit about the people who've passed through the land of Israel. Often when I think about this crossing through, I think about an African proverb that is a proverb that's attributed to the Gikuyu tribe of Kenya, which says, when elephants play, the grass gets trampled. When elephants play, the grass gets trampled, right? Since the land of Israel is such a central land bridge, there have been a great many elephants over the years. What I mean by this is obviously great empires. Each group of people that have chosen to stay and not just pass through the land have developed their own techniques of conquest. For example, let's start with the Jews. When they arrived from Egypt sometime in the 12th century BCE, under the command of Joshua, the Jews fight the Canaanites, the Canaanite nations, and in some places they defeat them and take over their land, and in other places they don't, and so they reach an accommodation and they live side by side with the Canaanites. The same goes for the Jews and their enemies, the Philistines. For many centuries they lived side by side. They weren't able to defeat each other. However, in the 8th and 6th centuries BCE, the Syrians and Babylonians pass through and control the land of Israel, and each one has its own unique way of conquest. Primarily, Assyria and Babylonia do what's called population exchanges. They move the Jews to Mesopotamia, and they replace the Jews with groups that come from Mesopotamia. And the Jews claim that the Samaritans, who still live in the land of Israel, were originally from Mesopotamia, and they replaced the Jews. So there was a replacement. By the way, this is not something which disappeared 2,800 years ago. Stalin did something very similar in the Soviet Union. He moved peoples around. When he was worried about the Koreans in Manchuria, he moved them to Crimea. When the Tatars in Crimea made problems, he moved them to Siberia. And he did this to other groups, the Balts and Chechens and Tatars and others. So this is also the story of the 10 lost tribes, because the goal of these population transfers is to destroy the association with a certain group, right? You're so far from your land and your people that you assimilate. And the 10 lost tribes is what exactly happens, right? In 720s BCE, they're shipped off to Mesopotamia and further, and they disappear to history until recently some groups are claiming some affiliation with the 10 lost tribe, which is its own interesting story. After the 10 lost tribe, the Babylonians also deport the Jews, right? The northern Israel is the 10 lost tribes. When the Babylonians capture the southern parts of Israel where Judah is, they ship them off in 586. And that's where we get the psalm, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. For those of you who know the Alpha Blondie version, you're welcome to sing along, the rivers of Babylon. Only in this case, after 70 years, Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, allows the Jews to return to the land of Israel. What happens when the Greeks arrive? They have a different attitude towards conquest. The Greeks actively promote their own culture. Their culture, what's known as Hellenism, and they strive to assimilate the Jews. The result is the Jews react to that, and that's what we know as the Hanukkah story and the rise of the Hashmonean dynasty. The Romans who come after the Greeks, what do? They try to force their culture? No, they're not that interested in that. The Romans arrive in 63 BC, and they don't care what their subjects believe so long as they gave unto Caesar what belonged to Caesar. They wanted their money, their taxes, and they wanted homage to Roman rule and its emperors. And they provided, they were happy if someone wanted to become a citizen. They provided incentives for people to become citizens, but they didn't have to be. And they didn't have to, worship Roman gods. They let everybody do their thing to an extent. Under Christian rule, which is the Byzantine era, and also then afterwards in 2 periods of Muslim rule. So we have Christian rule, Christian rule, Muslim rule, Christian rule, Muslim rule, for several hundred years, for over 1,000 years to be more precise. And they also provide incentives for people to convert. These were incentives that were financial as well as social. And this brings us up to the last 500 years, when we can talk about the Turks, the British, and the modern state of Israel. And let's look at how this issue was dealt with from about 500 years ago. The Ottoman Turks arrive in 1516 in the land of Israel and are only dislodged by the British in 1918. So we're talking about 402 years. The British kick out the Ottomans at the end of World War I, and for 400 years this is under Turkish or Ottoman control. During this period, the Turks develop a system of dealing with minorities under their control, and it's called the Millet or Millet System, and it is relevant, as you will see soon, to this very day. But it's a different way of dealing with it than previous conquerors dealt with the land of Israel. Let me open this up for you. All right. The Millet System comes from the word millah in Arabic, meaning nation, and it's a system that gives rights to ethno-linguistic and religious groups. It's a type of religious pluralism with non-territorial autonomy. In other words, you don't control a territory, and yet your community is autonomous, meaning recognized groups can set their own laws. They could even collect taxes, maintain schools, churches, hospitals, so education, life cycle events, legal, religious affairs were all of these were administered by leaders known as Millet Bashi. These are ethnarchs, and the head of the community was called the Chacham Bashi, who sat on the divan, which is like the Ottoman parliament system, and he was something like a counselor. Now, this doesn't mean that they were equal to Muslims. They had to show their loyalty to the empire and were still second-class citizens that were barred from being part of the Ottoman elite, but they had certain autonomy. So every confessional community, to make it more clear, every confessional community could be ruled under its own personal law. When I say personal law, I mean Sharia law for Muslims, halakha for Jews, and church canon for Christians. So this unique system developed in the 18th century, and originally there were only Jews, Greek Orthodox, and Armenians who were eligible to be considered a separate group. Ultimately, the system was based on Islamic rule and the idea of dhimmis, minorities who believed in one God and lived under Islamic rule. So these were kind of second-class citizens, but they weren't forced to convert because they had a notion of one God. So that's what's called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I-S, dhimmis. Over time, the Millet system was undermined by nationalism and the ideas of equality formulated by the French Revolution, right? There shouldn't be separate groups with their own laws. Everyone should have the same equality. And having said that, the Millet system continues in many post-Ottoman countries, including Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Greece, Lebanon, and has influenced the way other countries see their religious minorities. A version of the Millet system, though it's not called that today, continues up to this day in Israel as well. I think many Israelis are surprised even to realize that this is where it's coming from, but it's an Ottoman system which is still playing a very important role when it comes to religion and communities in Israel. All right, let's talk about the Israel Millet system and the way that it works. As I mentioned, it's best to think about this system as a form of legal pluralism. Imagine you're living in a country where there are more than one set of laws. I think Americans to some degree have an easier time imagining this because states have different laws, though the federal law, supersedes them, but there are different laws within different states. Here, within one country like Israel, there may be different laws based on, like I mentioned, halakha or sharia or canon. There is more than one normative order in one socio-legal state, in one socio-legal space. This is based on the idea of a polyethnic state rather than a melting pot model or an assimilationist state, right? So we're talking about a polyethnic state, and I'm going to come back to what that means, but it's different than an assimilationist state. And it continues because it was embraced by the British during the mandatory period, as well as Israel since 1948, since independence. It was embraced because removing the system risked the resistance of the various communities and could lead to instability. However, there are problems with this system. Keeping this system is not without its pitfalls. It means that certain communities are recognized, but not others. For example, the system recognizes Orthodox Judaism, but it does not recognize Masorti conservative Judaism, nor the Reform movement. There's one type of Judaism which is recognized under the system, which is the one that was from the 18th century on, and that's Orthodox Judaism. Hence, in Israel today, only the Orthodox can perform marriages in Israel, and only the Orthodox are eligible for state funds for their communities. Another issue is that people are placed in a group even if they are an atheist and based solely on their ethnicity. So if I'm Jewish or Muslim and I'm an atheist and I don't want to get married in front of a Qadi in the Muslim community or a rabbi, I'm still lumped in with them because that's the only recognized, there's no atheist group recognized. And another issue is that there are certain groups like the Druze, Baha'i, and Evangelical Episcopal who weren't recognized under the British and have only become recognized since the State of Israel. So in the past, they didn't have recognition. And there are groups that exist today that aren't recognized. For example, Maronite Christians are recognized, but Aramean Christians are not, even though they're recognized on their ID cards. Their Teudat Zehut says they're Arameans, but they're not one of the 14 recognized groups. Ethiopian Christians who have their own version of Christianity and are attested to in Jerusalem since the 4th century are not currently recognized. Neither are Ahmadi or Alawites. So in total, there are 14 communities that are recognized, and these are recognized for life cycle matters such as marriage, divorce, succession, alimony, wills, guardianship. Here's a list of the communities for you to take a look at. And you can see there's a blue line on the right side. The first 11 are the communities that were recognized formally during the British Mandate period. And the other last 3 are the ones I just mentioned were added since 1948. And I can tell you, by the way, that just north of us, in a smaller country called Lebanon, they have 16 recognized communities, including Jews. So for the 10 Jews that are still there, they're recognized as an official community in Lebanon. But again, this doesn't mean that these are the only groups. This isn't a list of, like a comprehensive list of cultural diversity of the land of Israel. There are many more religious traditions than just these 14, like the ones I mentioned, Alawites, Ahmadis, Sufis, conservative Jews, etc. And there are also ethnic groups that aren't recognized here, like Sudanese that live in Israel. There's a community that goes back to the 19th century, or Gypsies, or Mizrahim, or Ashkenazi for that matter. So these are the groups. And I want to step back and look at all of this from a macro level. And to do that, I want to start with a little pie chart here, which gives you a sense of what we're talking about in real numbers. So as you can see here, this is from a couple years ago, 2021, I think it was. As you can see here, Jews remain a majority in the land of Israel. We're a 3/4 majority, and that's pretty much where we've been since independence. We've lost a couple percentage points, but not by much. For the past 30 years, we've been told that Jews will soon be a minority. You can see that that hasn't happened yet. And in fact, Jews have very high birth rate, and the highest in the OECD, of all the OECD countries. So we have 7.5 million Jews living in Israel, approximately. And that's an important figure to think about because 2 dramatic things are about to occur. One is that the majority of the Jews in the world will live in Israel for the first time in over 1,500 years, within the next 5 years or so. Israel will have the majority of Jews in the world will be here. And that hasn't happened, like I said, for 1,500 years. And secondly, the state of Israel is about to cross the 10 million mark. We're going to have 10 million inhabitants here. Also here you can see there's a very large Muslim community in Israel, which typically ranges from 18 to 20% of the population. They're followed by about 2% Christian, 1.6% Druze, and various others, including atheists. Of course, like everything in Israel, the devil is in the details. And for example, this doesn't count foreign workers who are primarily Christian, who make up well over 100,000 people. And many of them live here for 10, 15, 20 years, though they're not citizens. And because it's important to use tangible examples, and since we would need several weeks to properly work our way through all the various millet and non-millet communities, I thought it would be better if we would start with a quick overview of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities in Israel writ large, and then follow that with an anthropological discussion that will try to make sense of it all. Okay? So, let's start with Judaism, which may be familiar to many people in the audience. First and foremost, if we look at this dendritic chart on the left side over here, we can see that Judaism is kind of the core of the monotheistic tradition, right? So I'm not talking here about Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, those kinds of things. I'm talking about religion or faith tradition. And that faith tradition of monotheism traditionally starts with Abraham. And as such, Christianity and Islam are both successor religions that also enshrine monotheism as part of their doctrine. But as you can see from this simplistic chart, Judaism sees itself as distinct from Buddhism and Hinduism, the former for its agnosticism and the latter for its polytheism. And it bears noting that as culturally diverse as Israel is, there is not even one Hindu or Buddhist temple in the country that I know of. Maybe Julia is familiar with something, but I've never seen a Hindu temple here. There are people who have little shrines in their houses, and there are adherents to Buddhism and even Jews who are Hare Krishna, but there's no temple per se anywhere that I know of in Israel. Though I heard there's a little Jain temple in the Diamond Center in Ramat Gan. Could be. Now, let's talk about the 4 branches of Judaism listed here on the left. This is what American Jews are very familiar with, and I want to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to give you another chart over here, because that's really a simplification. This chart opens up Judaism a little bit more. It has Samaritans who only believe in the 5 books or the Torah, and the Karaites who deny the Mishnah. So we have different Jewish traditions here. So you can see the Karaites. On the other hand, this doesn't really, I mean, it gives you a little bit with Hasidim and Reform, but I think that even this chart doesn't do justice to Judaism and also can lead to some heartburn over the issue at the bottom where it says heterodox Messianic Judaism. Are Messianic Jews Jews or not? We'll discuss it in a second when we talk about Christianity. But let's look at this chart, which I think is more, it's a better chart to understand what's happened to Judaism over time, and also how sophisticated and broad Judaism and complex Judaism is. And we can see here that in the middle line, we look at Rabbinic Judaism. Most Jews are descendants of Pharisees or Rabbinic Judaism. And the 2 big exceptions to that are the Samaritans on the left here, which see themselves as a straight line from the Sadducees or Tzdukim, and Karaite Judaism, which broke off from Rabbinic Judaism because it doesn't accept the Mishnah. It considers that not to be a holy book, and hence they don't accept the Talmud as well. And there are communities of Samaritans and Karaites living in Israel. There's only about 850 Samaritans. There are a couple, there maybe, I think 10,000, something like that, maybe even less Karaites in Israel. But there are communities of both who continue to live here. In addition, we have other groups like Hasidic and Reform, which are important groups in Judaism and growing in Israel and abroad. And I like this chart because it's a historical one from the top down, right? The oldest is higher up. And it shows that Messianic Judaism isn't a new phenomenon, because actually Christianity comes out of a Messianic form of Judaism from the Second Temple era. And we need to think about it that way, whether we accept Messianic Jews today as Jews. They're certainly not a continuation of that. The continuation of that older tradition is Christianity, which is what I want to talk about and show you what Christianity in Israel means. So Christianity, first of all, is the religion with the most adherents in the world, 2.2 billion. And it originates in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. It's based in Judaism, and it has very strong Jewish roots. So theologically and geographically, Christianity has a connection to the land of Israel. And this is because this is the place where Jesus was born, where he lived, where the miracles happened. It's a holy land for Christians, no less than it is for Jews in many ways. And this is the place where Jesus is crucified and resurrected. Many people are surprised to learn that the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is actually the holiest site on earth for Christians, and not Rome, where the Vatican is. The religion is based on the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, who is a Messiah, and he's a Messiah figure, and the God who sacrifices himself in order to return at the end of days. In Israel today, Christians are a small minority, and they make up about 300,000 people. Most church denominations have a presence in Israel, and you can see on the right side how many church denominations there are, and there are actually more than this. Most denominations have a presence in Israel, if not always a community for that presence. They may even have property, and they may even have someone else watching their property, but they don't have an actual community, yet all Christian groups have some kind of a connection to Israel. The thing about Christians living in Israel is that it's a bit unique and strange for them, because first of all, they're unaccustomed to being a minority, and they're a minority of 2% in Israel, and they're even less accustomed to being a minority when the government is a Jewish government, when their religion was meant to supersede Judaism, and here they find themselves 2,000 years later under Jewish rule. Another thing that's important to note about Christians in Israel is that they reside in Israel, unlike the Christians in the West, where you're used to Catholics or Protestants. Most of the Christians in Israel are Eastern churches, either the Eastern Orthodox or Melkite, which is a unique mix of Orthodox rites under the umbrella of the Vatican. And since this is its own, can of worms, I won't go into it today, but there could be a whole lecture just on that. There are also several early churches represented here, which are uncommon in the West, and these are called the non-Chalcedonian or Miaphysite churches, such as the Ethiopian and Armenian churches that have long existed in Israel. Since Christianity as a whole and these communities in particular are fascinating, and you could talk about it forever, I'm just going to leave it at that. But you get the picture. There's a lot to unpack here. And we also have to discuss briefly Islam. So what is Islam? And more to the point, what does it look like in Israel? Well, first of all, Islam is the second largest religion in Israel and the second largest religion in the world, right? It's catching up with Christianity, and perhaps in our lifetimes we'll know a world where Islam is the largest religion in the world. Islam begins in the 7th century CE, Common Era, in Arabia, when, according to the religion, the Prophet Muhammad is visited by the angel Gabriel, and he transcribes a book known as the Quran, or God's final revelation to man. Though the religious center of Islam is in Arabia, with the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the land of Israel is also historically an important place for Muslims and can't be just put aside as unimportant to them because Jews and Christians were here first. According to tradition, Muhammad himself visits Jerusalem on his night journey, known as Surah al-Isra al-Miraj, Quran chapter 17. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem is the third holiest site in Islam. And not only is it the third holiest site, the Golden Dome, Qubat al-Sakhra, was built in 691 CE and is the oldest surviving Islamic structure in the world. The city itself was captured by Caliph Omar in 638 and was under Muslim control from 638 to 1099, and then from 1291 to 1918, so for a very long time. And Islam is based on the 5 pillars. Many of you are probably familiar. I won't go into them, just to mention the belief in one God, or Shahada, prayer 5 times a day, Salat it's called, almsgiving or zakat, fasting during Ramadan for 30 days or saum, and pilgrimage or hajj, as I wrote it here. Let's talk about the branches of Islam and what it means for Israel. In the world, some 80% of Muslims are Sunnis, and about 15% are Shia. So Sunni vastly outnumber the Shia in the world, though in our area, because we're dealing with Iran and with Hezbollah, it doesn't seem that way. This division came about due to succession struggles following Muhammad's death. This had to do with the question that early Muslims faced about whether the new leader of the faithful after Muhammad's death had to come from the family of the Prophet or not. Sunnis ruled that all successors or caliphs didn't need to be related by blood to Muhammad, and Shiites reached the opposite conclusion. There's a third group, which is also an important one to remember, and that's the Sufi down here on the left. These are a mystical branch of Islam, which represents between 5 and perhaps even 10% of all Muslims. In Israel, there are 6 types of Islam. We can talk about 6 types of Islam. We have Sunni, Shia, Sufis, Shazaliya, Alawite, Ahmadi. So if we start from the top, Sunni, Shia, and Sufis, we just discussed. The vast majority of Muslims in Israel are Sunnis. There are a few Sufi communities in Israel which exist in Galilee and in Jerusalem. For example, if you look in the bottom left here, it says Shazil. The Shazaliya, they are a 19th century Sufi sect that are based today in Beirut, but since 1948 they've been based in Beirut, but they originate in Akko, where there's still a small handful of adherents and they have property. As for Shiites, there are almost no Shiites in the land of Israel, perhaps a handful, and they keep it to themselves, which is actually surprising if you think about it, because for 2 reasons. First of all, the land of Israel was ruled by the Shiite Fatimids for 120 years. And the country of Lebanon next door has a very large Shiite community, and yet we don't have any Shiites per se as a large community in Israel. That said, there are several groups that have their origin in Shiite Islam. For example, you'll see an arrow now where it says Alawi, the Alawites. The Alawites are represented in Israel in one community in Raja, but in Syria, they've ruled the country since the 1960s, and they're a branch of Shiite Islam who venerate Ali, the son-in-law and first cousin of Muhammad, as a Jesus-like figure. Another religion that came out of the Shia tradition is, as you can see the arrow on the left, the Druze, which is an Arab tradition, but not Muslim. They come out of Shiite Islam, though they wouldn't consider themselves Shiites today. And it originates in a different branch of Shia Islam than the Alawites, as you can see from this chart. Other groups are known as Mahdist groups. These are groups who believe that there's been a first coming of the Mahdi. Just like in Christianity, there's first and second coming. In some Islamic groups, they have a similar tradition. They believe that there's been the first coming of the Mahdi. Mahdi is the Messiah. And one of those groups that you can think of is the Ahmadiyya, which are here in Haifa, where I live. And they believe that the founder of the tradition was a prophet on par with Muhammad and even Jesus, and that there'll be another Mahdi in the future in probably 1400 years. And until then, they have to convince the world to follow their practices. Another Mahdist group, which we know of in Israel, are the Baha'i. Baha'i also come from a Mahdist tradition, and the Baha'i are no longer, I put them here on the bottom to the side, they are not Islamic, but they come out of Islam. They don't see themselves as Muslim, as opposed to the Ahmadis, who see themselves as Muslim, though the vast majority of Muslims do not consider them to be Muslim. So they're in between. Whereas Druze, they try to, play both sides. Sometimes they'll say that they are Islamic because they have Muslim holidays, and they're Arabs and they speak Arabic, but they play both sides. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're their own thing. All right. And this is all the monotheistic traditions. This is a chart I put together. It just meant as a summary. You're looking at the broad categories here. I'm, again, not pretending to cover every possible faith tradition or meaningful ethnic category. For example, under Jewish category, I could have easily added more ethnically distinct Jewish groups which have their own traditions, like Chinese Jews, Moroccan Jews, the Abayudaya or Lemba from Africa, Bukharan, and I would even say American Judaism has its own flavor. Or religious subgroups like Neolog or Reform, Conservative. I left it out on purpose to show that I'm not covering everything. And I'm aware also that I'm othering certain groups in this chart, right? I even put the word other, and I say Karaites are other, whereas Samaritans would take umbrage at this, because as far as Samaritans are concerned, they're the real Jews, and all the rest of us, are some, mock-up imitation. Similarly, under Christianity, Messianic Jews would bristle at being placed under Christianity. They would want to see themselves under Judaism. But there's a consensus among Jews that Messianic Jews, if you accept Christ as your Lord and Savior, you're no longer considered Jewish. So I put them under the Christian. And again, on the others, for the Ahmadi Druze, I already discussed about the consensus. All right, now that we've done all this, I want to get back to some theory and pull it all together and tell you what I think this means. Okay, now we have our baseline, and we can talk about what is a polyethnic state. Look on the map on the right. These are the ethnic groups of Austro-Hungary in 1910. And you can see it's pockmarked. There's so many different, look at all the red ones are all the Germans all over the place. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a very polyethnic state. What do I mean by that? I think Israel is a polyethnic state as opposed or contrasted to the classic idea of a melting pot or an assimilationist state, which was the main espoused approach in the US up until the 1970s. A polyethnic state is one which is also not an isolationist or monocultural state. We have states like that. Japan is a monocultural state. It doesn't have a lot of immigration, and there aren't many Japanese citizens from various, backgrounds. You're Japanese. Same for Korea. So polyethnicity is describing a situation in which a country has a great number of ethnic groups. It's a descriptive label which will help us to understand what makes Israel different and unique. And lastly, I want to talk here about anthropology. In anthropology, what we mean by when we say ethnicity. Ethnicity is simply a group of people who define themselves based on shared attributes that are different from those of the people around them. And these attributes can be anything. For example, shared cultural heritage, shared traditions, ancestry, race, shared history, religion, language, cuisine, dressing style, origin stories, myths, artistic styles, physical appearance, among others. I'll give you just one example of physical appearance. In Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island, the groups were supposedly divided up into those who had long ears and those who had short ears. And the differences had real-world implications for how people lived their lives. I mention that to point out that to emphasize that people will always find ways to distinguish themselves from each other. And it doesn't have to be all of the things that I mentioned before. It could be one of them or a combination of them. It is important, however, to highlight that traditionally, ethnicity is tied up in nationalism and nation building. So while ethnicity may seem to be something fixed or innate, like it's something that's part of you, in reality, it isn't. In fact, people move from one ethnicity to another quite regularly over time. Like I pointed out, this map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire prior to World War I today encompasses Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic. All of that is in this, today are states that came out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And over time, people either left or became the minority groups, as in the case, for example, of Germans and Jews. By this I mean the Germans who did not want to leave Hungary for Germany after hundreds of years of living in Hungary began speaking in Hungarian and downplayed their Germanness until it was no longer discussed, and if necessary, changed their names. In fact, genetic studies show that 7% of people who identify themselves as Hungarians have Jewish ancestry, which makes Hungary second only to Israel for people with Ashkenazi genes. In other words, in US, there's maybe 2% Jews. In Hungary, we have 7% of the population who are actually Jews, which is second only to Israel today in the world. And it's because people didn't even know that their families left and became, Hungarian instead of Jewish. It's a process of assimilation. And since I'm talking about this in a descriptive level, as a descriptive lecture, I'm not going into the question about whether assimilation is good or bad, except to say that like anything, it has its advantages and disadvantages. So now you ask, how is this any different than the much touted idea of multiculturalism, right? Polyethnicity seems like multiculturalism, but it's not. It's something very different, and that's what I want to talk about right here when we talk about multiculturalism and where it comes from. So for multiculturalism to exist, you need to have a polyethnic society. So it's predicated on polyethnicity. But rather than approach polyethnicity from a first among equals or a separate but equal approach, multiculturalism seeks to celebrate cultural diversity. Often, multiculturalism is termed as cultural plurality or ethnic pluralism. It's also more easily understood as the salad bowl or cultural mosaic approach to culture. It originally focused on ethnicity, right? Multiculturalism was focused primarily on ethnicity and ethnic groups, but today it has surpassed ethnicity and ethnic nationalism, and it includes subgroups such as LGBTQ, African Americans, and other groups that don't have national aspirations. In technical terms, it means that it includes groups that are not irredentist, right, who want to become independent. It was developed as an idea after the Holocaust. Multiculturalism, at least in part, the goal of multiculturalism was to make societies safe for Jews to live in, as well as other minorities within a nation state. It was promoted as an ideal precisely because Jews were, and continue to be, a subgroup without nationalist aspirations in their host countries. So there's no talk in the United States today of Jews, seceding from the US and creating their own country, right? And hence, they're a minority, they're a group in the country, they're an ethnicity, but they're not irredentist. And so how do we celebrate them? What do we do to prevent them from being kicked out of the nation state? Because the nation state supposedly belongs to Hungarians or Germans, any other group that you can imagine. So multiculturalism prevents assimilation and loss of culture, so there's a good thing about it. And it's because it allows different ways of being. And it's really one of the reasons for the success in the United States. Multiculturalism is the reason for the success of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Because it doesn't require assimilation or embracing the majority culture's standards. And for that reason, it sounds like a win-win situation. However, there are many critiques of multiculturalism, and we need to unpack those also. First of all, multiculturalism as an idea is opposed to the core principle of liberalism. Liberalism is based on safeguarding individual rights rather than communal rights. For example, what if a certain religious group believes, based on their reading of scripture, that their wives should be beaten into submission if they contradict their husbands? What if a certain society doesn't accept women's rights? Should that be allowed based on the principle of multiculturalism? What about polygamy? Should it be allowed? And if so, should the taxpayers provide unemployment benefits to the second and third wives if the first wife is already receiving money from the state? So you can see the problematics of it here. Secondly, in anthropology, there's the concept of cultural relativism. And this is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in anthropology, or in the social sciences, I think. It's come to mean that we can't judge other cultures. In reality, what it means is we need to judge a culture by its own standards. However, it doesn't mean that we have to accept its standards as superseding our own. Unfortunately, what happens is that multiculturalism tends to valorize other cultures over that of the host culture, and by doing that, it undermines the host culture. In the end, every culture, except for the host culture, is special and worthy of protection, and the host culture isn't. Another problem is that it can create divisions that undermine a society, since there's no common ethos. Studies have shown that the celebration of diversity can negatively impact civic engagement and creates parallel societies, since people do not share a common worldview. And it's exacerbated today by the compression of space thanks to the internet and social media, which causes problems because immigrants prioritize the maintenance of long-distance ties with their family over those of local communities, and it undermines social solidarity at the local level. And lastly, and perhaps most ironically and importantly for Israel, Native peoples, like Native Americans, have been some of the biggest critics of multiculturalism because it can and has been used to deny Native people their autonomy and their national aspirations. What do I mean by that? In Europe, this manifests in the notion of a multicultural Europe of people versus a Europe of nations. For example, the country of Spain weaponizes multiculturalism to deny the Catalan and Basque aspirations for independence, because it says to them, your aspirations are unnecessary in a European Union where the nation state is less relevant than it once was. So there's no need for you to be independent, even if you want to be independent. So you can imagine, if you think about this in Israel's terms, in the fraught politics of Israel, a call for multiculturalism along Western lines is in effect a non-starter, because it would be understood and perceived by Palestinians as an attempt to deny them the autonomy that they already have under the Millet System and any national aspirations that they have as Arab citizens of Israel. The fact that they already have a modicum of autonomy and independence explains, at least in part, why the Millet System persists to this day. All right, we've got, I think, 3 more slides. So if Israel is not really multicultural, how do we describe it? And in anthropological terms, we talk about this as a pillarized society. And it comes from Holland, from Netherlands, which prior to World War II was very divided between Protestant and Catholic. And it's the opposite of a melting pot society like the United States, where you all blend into one. And it's what we call a vertically divided or stovepiped society, where there's little or personal contact outside of a pillar. But by this, I mean you have all these kinds of pillars. So Protestants used to have their own political party. Catholics had their own political party. Protestants had their own newspapers. Catholics had their, and the same. You can keep going down this list, and you get the picture of what we're talking about here. We have other places in the world where we saw this and we see this, like Belgium, Ireland, the Balkans, and Israel. And I bring this up because if you think of assimilation as a melting pot where all the colors blend into one, and multiculturalism is like a salad bowl where everybody's in this bowl mixed together, I think that the pillarization can be thought of as like an Indian thali plate, where everybody's in their own little separate bowl. They may be on a larger bowl to some degree, but they're very separate and keep very separate from each other and have their own little communities, which is understandable, right? These independent and separate but similar institutions is not something which is anchored in the law in the way that apartheid was, but it's a self-sorting that comes down to personal preferences and the sense of connection and safety that a person has when they're with members of their in-group. So this isn't something unique. It exists in many places, but I think it does a better job of describing Israel than the other models when we think about them. All right, while this tali plate has advantages in a polyethnic state like Israel, it also runs the risk of polarization. And polarization, as we all know, is a huge problem today. It's being driven by social media, algorithms, and even places such as the United States that were predicated on assimilationist or melting pot models. Polarization between right and left, as we saw in the recent election, is leading to social tensions that are threatening the stability of the state. We saw a couple of days ago in Korea, almost had martial law. We have very high polarization happening there as well. I think, though, that if we think about the cross currents in Israeli society with religious, historical, political underpinnings, this represents a whole next level challenge to social cohesion and stability. It can often be like, a game of whack-a-mole or three-dimensional chess across multiple boards. For example, Israel is home to multiple faith traditions, which can be at odds with one another due to historical scores or doctrinal differences, or between religious and secular, just to give you a couple examples. And you can see all of these fault lines that I list here. So what is Israel? Is it really a cultural mosaic in the sense of it having some kind of order and, the implication that when you zoom out, you can see a picture? Or is it a stovepiped poly plate? Or is it something else? Perhaps it's more like a Jackson Pollock painting, unique and beautiful, yet chaotic and disturbing at the same time. Or if we want to continue with our food analogies, perhaps Israel is more like a syncretic project, which is bringing East and West together, like schnitzel with French fries inside a pita, where it's all kind of mashed. It's a mashup altogether. The truth is we don't know. Only time will tell. But in conclusion, I'm just going to repeat what I just said, which is that we may have only scratched the surface here, but I hope that this overview gives you a sense of the centrality, uniqueness, and diversity of Israel and its many coexisting groups and traditions. I wanted and tried to demonstrate here that Israel should be understood as a polyethnic environment as opposed to the U.S. ideal of a melting pot. By this, I don't mean multicultural, where there's overlap and celebration, but more like a tali plate, where everything is coexisting and separated into their own little bowls, yet still on one plate. As I discussed in anthropology, it's known as pillarization, or the vertical division of societies, sometimes known as parallel societies. Secondly, Israel is a complicated place with many cross currents and polarization, and is much more pluralistic than the U.S., than many people realize. And third, it's important to point out that the Ottoman Empire and the entire Middle East was once vibrantly diverse, like you saw in that map of Austro-Hungary. There were Armenians and Greeks in Anatolia, Assyrians and Chaldean Christians in Iraq, Yazidis, Zoroastrians, Mandeans, Bektashis, Jewish communities. Most of these communities barely exist anymore in this region. Israel is one of the last places on earth where this type of cultural diversity has survived. As such, I would argue that Israel is special, and more people should learn about this aspect of Israel so that Israel can be both celebrated and safeguarded. Okay, and last slide, I just wanted to share my information with you. If you enjoyed the presentation and you want to be in touch with me, you can see I have a project where I take tours to meet local people from different communities. On the top right, you can see people not places.tours. Take a look at the site. Please contact me. I'm also now trained to take people abroad. I'm taking my first group to Albania in a couple months. And I'm an expert on India. If anybody's interested in any of these areas, please contact me through this email or phone number, and I look forward to hearing from you. And with that, I will stop the share.
Great. Thank you very much. I never believed that anybody could be an amateur anthropologist and really understand cultural diversity. Thank you for giving us a 101 course on that. That's great. I had one question. I put it up on the chat, and that is, with the potential annex of West Bank, how will that affect Israel from an anthropological sense? What's likely there?
If you're talking about annex of A and B, or you're talking about area C?
Yeah, whatever you think might happen. I don't know.
Yeah, well, area C is one story. That's, where Jews live. And so it does make up the majority of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria.
Yeah.
Yet, in terms of cultural diversity, it won't change anything.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to annex A and B, then the predictions of Jews becoming a minority in the land of Israel would become true over time, probably. And that's why there's a great reticence to do such a thing. I don't see people, except on the far right, talking about annexing the major Palestinian population centers. The other option is what's happened in the Palestinian centers, which is it's not ethnically diverse, right? Jews were kicked out of those places. There are no Jews living today in Hebron or in Bethlehem, in any of these places. These have been ethnically cleansed of Jews and other groups which didn't fit the model. And this is actually what we've seen in Europe. I showed you the map of Austro-Hungarian Empire, but I could do it in other parts of Europe as well, where over time, as the rise of the nation state and the nation state developed, what happened was either people assimilated, or they were killed, or they were expelled. All three of those things, and usually a combination of them, happened. And now, for the first time in very long, or before World War II, we're seeing cultural diversity in Europe again, and we're seeing problems again in Europe. So this isn't something unique to the Middle East, but I don't see Israel annexing areas A and B. And I think it would be a mistake to do so. If you're asking me as an anthropologist, I think it would be a very big mistake to do so.
Great, thank you. Ilana, you want to manage if there are any other questions?
All right, there's another question from Harry. What do you foresee for the future of Israel? That is, which way will it lean? And does it depend on the outcome of the current wars, disputes throughout the Middle East?
By lean, what do you mean?
Harry,
lean?
you want to unmute?
Pillarization, more of that, isolating groups, or different ethnic groups working together.
I think that there can be coalitions, and there are at times. The last government had Arabs in the government, and in the past, Arab parties, for example, have supported the government from outside, whether they were inside or not. I think that there's possibility within Israel for cooperation, but I don't think that there's interest by any side for there to be the type of, melting pot or assimilationist, kumbaya ideal that exists in the United States. And I can tell you an example of that, which is, if you're talking about marriages between Jews and Arabs in Israel on an average year, so I'm outing myself here. My father's sister, my aunt, is married to a Palestinian Arab and lives in an Arab village and has 3 children who see themselves as Arabs and have Arab names, etc. It is exceedingly rare. I looked into the statistics. It's about 35 marriages a year of that kind. So it's a really rare occurrence when that happens. And both sides, you know, even though you'd think that Muslims would feel like, oh, you know, we've got one of them now, you know, it's not like that. There's just too much, you know, history there. And so even, you know, Boy Scout and Girl Scout groups doing things together almost never happens. There's still this pillarization. Now, having said that, I showed you an example of the Netherlands. World War II shuffled all the cards, right? Because they had to come back together. Oh, can you see me? Hello?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can see you.
Log in with
Oh.
Google.
Well,
Very small.
We're watching.
the display is
It says-
not what you want.
Oh, okay, but as long as you can hear me, that's fine. You can
Yeah, we
see
can
me.
hear you.
That's all that matters. So, yeah, World War II shuffled all the cards, and Dutch society came out of it very different than it went into it. And so anything is possible, right? There, after World War II, I don't know if you like science fiction novels, but after World War II, there were a slew of science fiction novels and books about alien invasions of planet Earth. And the idea was, you know, we just came out of this world war where everyone was killing everybody. Maybe if aliens invaded, we would all join forces and understand that we're all brothers and, you know, we can all live together. But until that happens, I don't see it happening here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what screen is up here. Is that yours?
Neither am I.
Oh,
Oh, is this not yours, Eyal?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, someone's home PC has an S on it. I don't
Well,
know.
I
Alana,
can
you
share
should
mine
be
if you
able
want,
to
but
stop the share as the host.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
Right. Hey, I will take the opportunity to say good night and Laila Tov. Thank you all for coming. Great to see you. Yan, toda raba. נהיה
Lala.
בקשר. Good night, and Steve will talk.
We'll talk.
Thanks
Okay.
so
Well,
much, Julia.
Okay.
Steve is in charge of
Take
talking.
care.
All right, we're not going anywhere.
All right, I'm here. I'm all
All
yours.
right. See, any other questions out there, Alana?
Feel free to unmute. Not that I see in here, just people saying thank you, and it was a wonderful talk and everything like that. Happy to see you again. If
Yes.
anyone else has a question, please feel free to unmute.
Hopefully,
All right.
you learned something new.
Mhm.
A lot of new information.
I do have a question.
Yeah,
Could you-
sure.
An area you bordered on showing the different Jewish groups like Reconstructionists and all that.
Right, right.
At some point, and in the future, there has to be some accommodation for all these people by the Hasidic community. How would that happen? Or is it never to happen?
I mean, obviously, this is a political issue. And so for that to happen, you know, if a couple million American Jews immigrate to Israel,
Right.
up to now, I think since Israel was founded, about 300,000 Americans have immigrated to Israel.
Is that right?
It's only like 3,000 a year or something like that at times. Very few people. So they don't have any, you know, this is the way American Jews think about Judaism. Israeli Jews don't think about it that way because they're accustomed to the Orthodox being in charge.
Yeah.
And so the Orthodox certainly will never give up their primacy. But even the average Israeli doesn't understand why they would need to give up their primacy because they're so used to the system as it is, which is that they're secular Jews. And, you know, when you ask an Israeli, if you ask an Israeli, are you religious? They say, no. How can you say such a thing? But then you go into it and you ask them, you say, do you have a meal on Rosh Hashanah? They say, of course. We have pomegranates and we eat, dip apples in honey. Do you light candles on Hanukkah? Yes. Do you, do a Seder and Pesach? Yes. Do you have Shabbat candles and Challah? Yes. So they're living Jewish, they're doing Jewish, but they don't see themselves as being Jewish in the sense that Americans think of Jewish because it's separated America into being, not only an ethnicity, but also a religion, which is kind of this bargain that Jewish communities had to do ever since the French Revolution to divide themselves up to be both an ethnicity and a religion, whereas traditionally they weren't. They were just Jews.
Hmm.
And
Can you hear me?
yes,
Go ahead.
I can hear
I
you.
have a question. We heard an economist speak in New Orleans about the ultra-Orthodox and the economics involved in Israel, that they are riveting the country because of the financials, the army service. Is that not an interior threat to the survival of Israel as well?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into politics here, and I'm fine with that, but it it's certainly an issue. I mean, how to put this? So the religious communities that came to Israel after the Holocaust were coming from a Europe in which they felt very separate from culture and society, and they were very insular. And after the Holocaust, they became even more insular because part of the rationale that they had was that they weren't religious enough, and hence something like the Holocaust could happen. And so they had to double down. This is what you see anywhere in the world, right? Islamists do the same thing. They figure if we lost to the West, that means that we need to be more Muslim. We need to be more faithful. So religious Jews did the same thing. When they came to Israel, they didn't see themselves as part of the Zionist project because, in fact, they were opposed to the Zionist project in Europe, right? But today there's such a large group, and because Israel's political system is designed in a parliamentary style where we have kingmakers who, with 15% of the vote, can decide which side will be. They've played both sides off each other, and they've avoided full participation. That has to stop. There is a consensus today that needs to stop, and I suspect that whatever governments come in the future, there'll be a push to prevent it. But having said that, this current government isn't going to end it anytime soon, the subsidies or the exemptions. And there's a lot of anger in Israeli society today over both of these things because there's always, the government always said there's no money for this or that project, but there's always money for religious projects to keep them in the coalition. And then the religious Jews say we can't serve in the military. It's a secular body and it will make our boys leave the religion and not stay within the fold. And then religious Zionist Jews who are very religious and study Talmud, they say, what do you mean? We serve in the army and we're capable of doing it. Why are you better than us? Right? And so we have a lot of tension in the society today over these issues. And Netanyahu, starting probably around 2013, 14, as this craziness was happening everywhere in the world, began really polarizing society against each other. And so, yeah, it could undermine society, but that would be a self-goal. It would be a tragedy if in the end Jews ended up fighting with Jews, though it's happened in the past in history.
Yeah. Is there any other anthropological example parallel to the Israeli military, not military argument?
What do you mean by?
Well, the religious people deferring military service versus everybody else. Is there
Well, the religious people, I would argue, they're disingenuous when they argue that why should they serve if the Arabs don't serve?
Right. Oh,
That's one of the first arguments that they'll always bring up. They'll say, well, if Arabs serve, then we'll serve as well.
Right.
Okay? They're 20% of the population. We're 15% of the population. Why shouldn't they serve in the military? They know they don't mean it. That's why it's disingenuous. But they argue that point and they say, well, if you really want equality and equity, then this is what should happen. Arabs can serve in the military if they want to. And certain communities like the Druze and the Circassians are drafted into the military. But they're not, the other Arabs are not forced to. And there's a reason for that, because Israel isn't sure what their loyalty will be in a time of war. And, it'd be nice to say that, yeah, everything's great and we all get along, but we don't know what their loyalty will be. We know, for example, with the Druze community, that in the wars that we've had where Druze have had to fight against Druze, like in Lebanon or in Syria, in many cases they refused to do so. Okay, and they were moved elsewhere. And so bringing in, Muslims is problematic as long as there's no, from an anthropological perspective, I would say what you could do is widen Zionism in some way to include Arabs, right? To make them, feel like they're part of the Zionist project. But there's no interest at the moment to do that, and it would take some jiggering to do it. So I don't see it happening, and I don't see the religious Jews unless they're forced to when they cut off their funds, because now they're living off of government subsidies, which were meant originally to be for 400 people, and now pay for 160,000 people. I don't see, it's not a sustainable project. Any other
Great.
questions?
Well, if there are no further questions, I think we just received a Major League College course, 101, maybe 102, because you've been here before. I remember your prior conversation. And by the way, on the internet, on YouTube, we now have an index. And if you go to tinyurl.com/VFI educates 5, the number 5, it will bring you to an index. And in the index, you can see the prior presentation and all the other 100, 200 presentations that are out there since we've been doing this since June of 2020. And so that's a new development. It now has an index, and the index is on our website also. It explains what Educates is about on the website. We didn't have that before, plus this index. So it's VFI Educates number 5 under tinyurl.com. So great. Well, let's wrap up. Any other thoughts, Ilana? Okay.
No.
Well, great. Well, let's thank Dr. Dujovny for his presentation today, and hope to see you again. And
Thank you so much.
I think we're going to have to tune in and watch the presentation again on YouTube starting next week, just to get the subtleties of all the information you've poured into our poor heads. All good stuff. Very human.
Steve, I would tell you, thank you for what you do.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, this time we're going to stop the recording. We're going to go into schmooze mode, and we can stay around here till like 7 o'clock if anybody wants to catch up on things. And
For me, that would be 7 o'clock in the morning.
That's right. So thank you so much for joining with us today. I'm going to stop the recording here.